everyone. Thanks for joining us for this WTTW News Special. I'm Brandis Friedman. Here's what we're looking at.
What I have been warning of is now being realized.
Governor Pritzker says federal officials are looking to deploy military troops to Illinois. And the latest in our continuing coverage of police and policing in Chicago. Reform groups say CPD's increased use of force violates the consent decree. What the Supreme Court's recent decision on racial profiling could mean for local policing, and the cost of repeated misconduct by some Chicago police officers. We dig into that data. First off tonight, before we get to our focus on local policing, after weeks of speculation, Illinois National Guard troops may be deployed to protect immigration and customs enforcement agents.
Moments ago, the Illinois National Guard received word that the Department of Homeland Security has sent a memo to the Department of War seeking the deployment of 100 military troops to Illinois, claiming a need for the protection of ICE personnel and facilities. What I have been warning of is now being realized.
While it remains uncertain when those troops could be deployed, tensions continue to escalate in West Suburban Broadview between local leaders and immigration and customs enforcement agents. Broadview police say they are investigating after a federal ICE agent allegedly fired a, quote, chemical munition at a vehicle driven by a local television news reporter. On Saturday, a CBS Chicago reporter shared on social media that an ICE agent, quote, took a direct shot at her car as she was driving near the ICE detention facility to check out the scene. The facility has been the site of multiple clashes between protesters and federal agents. The U.S. Attorney's Office late this afternoon saying 5 people are facing federal charges, including resisting arrest, assaulting a federal officer, and threatening to kill a federal agent during protests over the weekend. Cook County homeowners have just 2 weeks to apply for property tax relief from the county's new Homeowner Relief Fund. County officials say the $15 million program is intended to support those who've experienced substantial increases in property taxes in recent years.
If you're in an area where the property values are lower, people end up walking away from property and it becomes vacant because of high taxes and increases that are unexpected. And in other communities, your people who are long-term residents are forced to move. None of that is tenable and none of it is something that we should oversee and not try to change.
Selected recipients will receive $1,000 in one-time assistance. To qualify, homeowners must have experienced a property tax increase of at least 50% in the 2021, 22, and 23 tax years, as well as meet certain income requirements. The Cook County Homeowner Relief Fund was passed in the county's 2025 budget. Applications are open through October 10th. For how to apply, check out our website. Up next, our latest WTTW News Special on police and policing in Chicago. That's right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Alexandra and John Nichols family, the Jin and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
A coalition of police reform groups are raising new concerns about a significant increase in the number of times Chicago police officers are using force against members of the public. The uptick comes more than 6.5 years after Chicago officials agreed to put the police department under extensive oversight from a federal judge. Our Heather Sharon joins us now with the latest on the Chicago consent decree. Heather, break down these numbers for us. How often do Chicago police officers use force?
Well, CPD's own data shows that between 2021 and 2024, the number of times police officers used any kind of force increased 75%. Now, the coalition, led by the American Civil Liberties Union of Illinois, says that's very troubling. They're especially concerned because the number of times officers have used what they call lethal force, or the most serious level of force, has more than doubled between 2023 and 2024. In all, Chicago police have shot 17 people so far this year, killing 8, more than in all of 2024.
The consent decree, prompted, of course, by a federal investigation that found CPD routinely violated the rights of Chicago's Black and Latino people. What has changed since 2019?
Not much, according to the coalition. They say before the consent decree, 90% of Chicagoans who were subject to a use of force by a Chicago police officer were Black or Latino, and it is still over 90% 6.5 years later.
How has CPD brass responded to this increase?
Well, Chicago Police Superintendent Larry Snelling says that the increase is not actually there. It is just a matter, he says, of officers fulfilling the terms of the consent decree, which requires every use of force to be documented properly with what's called a tactical response report. Now, the coalition does not buy that argument, and that is what they are asking the federal judge overseeing the consent decree case to dig into.
So the coalition, they told the federal judge overseeing the court case that increase, of course, violates the consent decree, and they have started the process of attempting to enforce the agreement. What happens now?
Well, they have 45 days to meet with everybody involved with the consent decree. That also involves the Illinois Attorney General to hammer out sort of a way forward. Now, what the coalition wants is pretty stringent. They want a binding agreement that will set clear benchmarks for the use of force by Chicago police officers with the aim of reducing their use of force in 2025 back to levels last seen in 2022.
Okay, a lot of work cut out for them. And of course, Heather Sharon will see you a bit later on in the program. Thank you.
You sure will.
And you can read Heather's full story on our website. It's all at WTTW.com/news.
WTTW News coverage of policing and police reform is supported by the Joyce Foundation.
A recent Supreme Court decision is raising concerns about racial profiling in federal law enforcement as immigration raids ramp up. But locally, advocates say discriminatory policing is nothing new. They believe the Chicago Police Department has a history of disproportionately targeting Black and Latino people in shootings, traffic stops, arrests, and more. And some advocates worry the High Court's ruling could potentially impact local policing. Joining us now for more on racial profiling are Jasmine Smith, an organizer with Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression; Kimberly Marshall, a retired Chicago police officer who now works in the mental health field; Raph Donaldson, professor of law at the Chicago-Kent College of Law; and Lauren Jones, director of criminal legal systems at Impact for Equity. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Thank you. Raph, I want to start with you, please, because earlier this month, the Supreme Court made a move that makes it easier for federal immigration agents to use ethnicity as a factor in deportations. Could this ruling spill over into the way, Chicago police polices our communities?
Well, it could. So the first thing to mention is the Supreme Court actually didn't issue any new opinion of any kind. The Supreme Court just issued an order and said the temporary restraining order issued by the judge out in Central California is not to go into effect. It's to be stayed. What happened is that one of the Supreme Court justices, Justice Kavanaugh, issued his opinion about why he thought the order shouldn't go into effect, why it should be stayed. And he mentioned that he thought that racial profiling was okay and had been approved by previous precedents by the Supreme Court. And local law enforcement may overread what Justice Kavanaugh said and let its officers use more racial profiling than perhaps they had before.
And of course, that would be, something that if someone wanted to file a claim, that would go to court later on, which is a whole other thing that I hope we get into tonight. But Lauren, how do you think this could impact Chicago locally, given what we're hearing just today, the ongoing National Guard threats and ICE operations in the area?
As you mentioned, Chicago has a long history of racial profiling, and there's been a lot of work done to try to remedy that through instruments like the consent decree, through policy changes. And advocates and organizers are really concerned that the rhetoric and this statement issued by the Supreme Court will have a trickle-down effect on tampering some of those advancements, or opening the door for more racial profiling to happen from officer to officer that is not remedied at a later date. And so we are really trying to point to the city to double down on those reform efforts and to re-amplify the commitment to the consent decree that has a ban on racial profiling, that requires officers to report when they see someone racial profiling, another officer racial profiling. And these commitments are in place. We just need to be sure that we are setting the examples as a progressive city to double down.
Jasmine, you've had your own personal experiences with racial profiling. What was that like? What happened?
So it's a enraging situation, being racially profiled, being a person that was racially profiled. But luckily, just recently, we had an experience with our tablers, my organization, Chicago Alliance Against Race and Political Repression. We have volunteers that go out in the communities to table information and literature, what we're doing, giving away free education on how people can protect their rights, how people can get involved with holding the police accountable and stuff. And the police oftentimes abuse their authority and their power and try to scare our workers and even myself, address us where we're going to lock you up, you have to move this, you can't be here and you can't be that. But I know my rights. There's no crime that we are committing by giving out free information to the communities. And of course, the situation that we had just a couple of weeks ago, it was with a white officer. It wasn't with a black officer. And even his partner was like, we're not trying to, I apologize for what he just said, because he said things out of the way, like to threaten, I'm trying to be nice to you guys,
So it sounds like you felt he was making unnecessary threats.
He was making unnecessary threats.
Do you feel like it's ever happened, just walking down the street, driving your car?
Yes, even driving my car, I'm a concealed carry. They pulled me over, no probable cause, but because they ran my plates, and my plates say that I guess I'm concealed to carry, they pulled me over, and luckily, I'm a black woman. I wasn't it was no smell or anything, and my daughter was in the car, and my grandson was in the car. But I asked them, what is the reason of you pulling me over? Well, they say that you are concealed to carry. Do you have your gun in your vehicle? So immediately I said no, but what is your reason of pulling me over? Whether I'm concealed to carry or not, that's not probable cause for you guys to be pulling me over. Is my headlight or something tail light out? My plate expired? None of these things. So they pick and choose different ways and different mechanisms of what they want to do to encounter with community that they feel probably are not knowledgeable of their rights, or just to
you feel like they're using intimidation tactics,
yes,
basically expecting
correct.
that you wouldn't know how to respond. According to the Illinois Department of Transportation in Chicago, black people made 45% of traffic stops by CPD in 2024, but 31% of the city's population. Latinos made up 35% of all traffic stops by CPD, compared to being 29% of the city's population. That is all compared to white people making up 15% of stops, while being 33% of the population. Kimberly, I want to come to you for the first time. What do you make of some of these ongoing federal threats, given the city's long history of racial profiling?
It's unfortunate that the Supreme Court is not willing to protect those rights that are already in place. And it's looking more and more like a Dred Scott Supreme Court, as far as I can know. My experience as a Chicago police officer, they don't teach that we should racial profile. That's not in part of anything that we were taught in the police academy. As a matter of fact, I was on the police department when community policing when they first came out with community policing.
Because you served on the force from 1990 to 2010.
So what I saw was that department policy is against that and in agreement with the decree. I'm sorry, the consent decree.
Consent decree.
And but individual officers, because they are human beings, they bring their own bias and their own prejudice, and so you have to. You know, you can't throw a total blanket and say, well, you know, all the police are bad and all of that, because the things that they tolerate, it seems like, as a whole, as far as punishing one officer for this and maybe not another officer for the same thing, and then the individual officers making the decision who should be stopped and who is bad and who is good.
It ends up being a lot to officers' discretion. Lauren, why do you, I mean, we just discussed some of these numbers that we got from Illinois Department of Transportation. Why do we still see these disproportionate trends years after the consent decree's implementation? 6.5 years.
Yeah, so I can focus a little bit on just the traffic stop portion to branch off from that, but there are policies that prevent officers from engaging in racial bias, stopping people because of the color of their skin or where they live, but we are seeing that there's justifications based on, you know, there's crime in this area, or, you know, I wasn't stopping them because they're black, I'm stopping them because they have a broken taillight. And so these justifications allow for individual officers and practices as a whole to sort of bend the policies, bend the Constitution, create loopholes there that allow for racial profiling to continue. And we're seeing, even just last year, there was a 4% increase of Latina stops of Latina drivers from 2023 to 2024. And so you can see that some of those trends coming from the federal level are being reflected in sort of these individual officers' decisions to continue to racially profile and commit excessive stops without seeing any real public safety benefits from those stops.
So, Raf, as we discussed earlier, the Supreme Court decision sort of loosens, you know, whether or not it can happen and can allow officers to sort of, on the federal level anyway, sort of factor that into their decision making when choosing to stop someone or pursue someone. But because the burden of proof lies with the person who believes that they have been profiled, if that should happen, how does one prove racial profiling in a court of law?
Yeah, proving racial profiling is very difficult because the Supreme Court doesn't allow one to bring just statistical information of the sort that you just mentioned. So mentioning that black people are disproportionately stopped or arrested, that actually isn't sufficient evidence because the Supreme Court has said that they don't accept that. They have to actually prove the actual intent to bring some sort of claim against them, and that's really difficult. So I think that that's one of the barriers that we face legally. The thing that the plaintiffs brought in the case that reached the Supreme Court that was stayed, instead of bringing evidence particularly about them being racially profiled, instead what the plaintiffs argued is that there wasn't sufficient evidence of reasonable suspicion before the stops. And so the only reason why they could have been stopped is for racist reasons. You don't have to prove the racial intent. All you have to prove in that situation is that there just wasn't reasonable suspicion in the first place. And that's what they attempted to prove. And despite a favorable treatment by the district court, the Supreme Court did not allow that order to go into effect.
It's not quite the same thing as saying racial profiling did happen. Sorry, Kimberly, so, you know, you mentioned that when you were serving on the police force, you weren't, you know, of course, taught to racially profile people, but was there any training on not racially profiling people, on unconscious bias?
Well, they did have sensitivity training. And one of the things that I want to mention that I think is important is in 1968, most departments, including the Chicago Police Department, enacted a program called Salt and Pepper. What they found was that the backgrounds of the white officers and the black officers, they didn't know each other. They didn't know about them personally. They lived here, we lived there. There was not a lot of integrating. And so they started the Salt and Pepper teams so that the white officers and the black officers could learn more about each other and about each other's community. It was successful. I remember officers when I came on that were retiring that did work in Salt and Pepper teams, and that it was effective, and they did get to know the black officer and his community and his family better, so they got a better understanding.
We're almost out of time, Jasmine. I want to give you the last word. Because along those lines, right, like the police department tried something then, how can police better address crime without disproportionately targeting communities of color?
Well, the police have to have humanity, number one. The police have to come in with being fair and on the side of justice and giving people their due process and not biasly judging them off of appearance and stuff like that. We have an issue with police not being held accountable. So we have to look at that right now more than ever. Like the superintendent has the power to address a lot of these cops that are still on the force to this day that's caused harm to the community. So when you start addressing the root of issues and cleaning our house, then it'll be a lot better for our communities and the constituents to trust the police.
So the most important thing, problem.
Yeah, you have to hold them accountable. They have to be fired.
All right,
they have to be charged for their crimes.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Not something we're all going to solve right now, but it's the work lies ahead. Our thanks to Jasmine Smith, Kimberly Marshall, Raph Donaldson, and Lauren Jones. And we're back with more of our WTTW news special on police and policing in Chicago right after this. Chicago taxpayers have paid nearly $300 million over a 6-year period because of repeated misconduct by some police officers. In all, 272 officers were named in at least 2 lawsuits that were settled by Chicago officials or resulted in a jury verdict paid by taxpayers. That is in spite of efforts to rein in cops who repeatedly violate the rules. Reporters Jared Rutecki and Heather Sharon join us now with what they found. Jared, how big of a problem is the city facing from repeated allegations of police misconduct that result in lawsuits?
Cases involving repeat officers cost taxpayers $75.8 million. That's about 85% of the total from 2024, and more broadly, about 60% of the nearly $500 million total over the past 6 years during the consent decree. This totals kind of allow us to look at the high cost of vehicle pursuits and wrongful convictions. While many officers in these groups have retired in some of the older cases, about 9 of the officers still remain on the force, and 8 of them still in Chicago and 1 located in suburban Oswego.
Okay, Heather, you focused on one officer in particular, Joseph Treacy. Tell me why.
Well, he has been named in a number of lawsuits over the past 6 years that have cost the city $500,000, including one that was tied to the death of an Indianapolis man who he and another officer shot to death amid a brawl in Mount Greenwood that exacerbated racial tensions. Now, Officer Treacy, although he is still paid by taxpayers, actually hasn't worked a single shift as a police officer since 2018. He has been on long-term disability, earning 75% of his salary. The number of officers who are on long-term disability or medical leave has become a source of frustration for city council members who are struggling to close a deficit of $1.15 billion next year. And they say there are simply too many officers on disability or on leave for that to continue.
Jared, this is the 4th time that you've looked at the data and analyzed its cost to taxpayers. Is the city being transparent about the cost of lawsuits that name the same officers repeatedly?
The impact of police misconduct is evident. The city has spoken for years about the risk that they're trying to mitigate in a number of these cases. The publication of this data is a move towards transparency, and the city deserves a small pat on the back for this, but we really have to dig up some of the specific names of officers and badge names so that we can identify everybody, and this kind of makes it so that researchers and reporters like me have to track this information down to sort of unravel these mysteries. It's going to be important to kind of identify some of these risks moving forward for the city.
Heather, why don't city officials step in, though, and, put a stop to those officers who are already costing taxpayers money? Why can't the city stop them from doing it again?
Well, the federal court order known as the consent decree requires the city to do just that. Not only are they supposed to be tracking lawsuits that name the same officer over and over again, there's supposed to be an early warning system that gives departments leaders a heads up that some officers are having trouble following the rules, might need some retraining, might need to be taken off the street. Despite years of effort, there's no timeline for that system to be in place, which is significantly overdue.
Okay, Heather Sharon, Jared Rotecki, thanks to you both.
Thanks, Brandis.
And you can read Jared and Heather's full story on our website. It is all at WTTW.com/news. And that's our show for this Monday night. You can stream Chicago Tonight on our WTTW YouTube channel every evening and catch up on any programs you may have missed. And join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 10. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm that gives back to the community through law and philanthropy.